Under the dim, flickering fluorescence of the office's late-night hush, where shadows stretched long and jagged across the carpeted floors, Daniel trudged wearily from his cubicle, his footsteps muffled by the oppressive silence that clung to the empty building like a shroud. His eyes, bloodshot from hours of staring at spreadsheets that blurred into meaningless numbers, ached for a break, and his stomach growled with a hollow insistence that dragged him toward the break room, where the vending machine stood as the only sentinel in the desolate space. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight, its hands creeping with a slowness that seemed to mock his exhaustion, and as he approached the machine, its usual hum replaced by an eerie stillness, she noticed something off. Something that made the hairs on his neck prickle despite the stale, recycled air. Instead of the familiar grid of chips, candy bars, and overpriced granola, the glowing screen displayed a single option in stark, white letters against a black void. Your favorite, it read. The words pulsing faintly as if alive, beckoning him to press the button beneath it with a curiosity he couldn't shake. His fingers hovered over the keypad, trembling slightly from caffeine and unease, before he gave in, jabbing the button with a force that echoed in the quiet, and with a soft thud. An unlabeled plastic bag slid into the dispenser tray, its contents shrouded in shadow until he tore it open under the flickering light. Inside, still warm as if fresh from an oven, lay a handful of homemade cookies golden brown, soft, with a faint scent of vanilla and a texture so precise it stopped his brother's exact recipe, the one she'd baked every Sunday of his childhood until her hands grew too frail to knead the dough, a memory so vivid it flooded his mouth with saliva and his mind with questions he couldn't answer. As Daniel stood there in the break room, the flickering light overhead casting jagged shadows that danced across the linoleum floor like restless spirits, he held the warm cookie in his hand, its heat seeping into his palm while the scent of vanilla and browned butter coiled around him, pulling him back to a time when his mother's kitchen was a sanctuary, not a ghost haunting the edges of his memory. The office, with its sterile walls and the distant hum of a printer left running in some forgotten corner, felt suddenly alien, as though he'd stumbled into a space that wasn't entirely real. And the vending machine, its screen still glowing with that cryptic, your favorite, message watched him with a mechanical patience that unnerved him more than the silence ever could. He bit into the cookie, unable to resist despite the unease gnawing at his gut, and the taste exploded across his tongue, soft, chewy, with just the right hint of salt to balance the sweetness. Exactly as he remembered from those long-gone Sundays, when his mother would hum old tunes while the oven warmed the house, her apron dusted with flour, and her smile a quiet promise that everything would be okay. But everything wasn't okay now. Not here in this empty office, where the clock ticked too slowly, and the air tasted of dust and recycled despair. And as he chewed, the realization sank in that this couldn't be coincidence. No machine could replicate a recipe lost to time, one he'd never spoken of to anyone, one that lived only in the recesses of his mind and the ache of his loss. Swallowing hard, the crumbs catching in his throat like tiny accusations, he stared at the remaining cookies in the bag, their perfection mocking him as questions piled up in his skull, each one heavier than the last. How did it know? What did it mean? And why here? Why now? In this godforsaken office, where he'd spent too many nights chasing deadlines that never seemed to end. He shoved the bag into his pocket, the plastic crinkling against his thigh, and turned away from the machine, its screen still pulsing faintly, as if daring him to ask. But he couldn't bring himself to look back, not yet, because the weight of that cookie sat in his stomach like a stone, familiar yet foreign, a gift he hadn't asked for and didn't trust. The walk back to his cubicle stretched longer than it should have, the hallway tilting slightly under the strain of his exhaustion and the growing sense that something had shifted. Something he couldn't name but could feel pressing against his ribs, and when he sat down at his desk, the glow of his computer screen offered no comfort. Its cold laid a stark contrast to the warmth still lingering on his fingertips. He tried to focus on the numbers, the endless rows of data that had kept him here past midnight, but his mind kept drifting back to the vending machine, to the impossible cookies, to the question of whether he'd imagined it all, or if someone had reached through time to place them in his hands, and the thought made his skin crawl even as his mouth watered for another bite. By the time he left the office, the sky outside bruising into dawn, he'd eaten 2 more, each one tasting of home and dread in equal measure. And though he told himself it was nothing, just a glitch, a prank, a fluke, couldn't shake the feeling that the machine wasn't done with him, that it had more to offer, more to take, and that tomorrow night, when the clock ticked past midnight again, he'd find himself standing before it once more, drawn by a hunger he didn't understand and couldn't refuse. The next night, when the office had emptied out again, and the silence settled over the building like a thick fog, Daniel found himself back at his desk. The glow of his monitor casting a sickly pallor across his face as he wrestled with the same spreadsheets, their numbers blurring into a meaningless haze that mirrored the fog in his mind. He hadn't slept well. Dreams of his mother's kitchen had twisted into nightmares of her standing by the vending machine, her frail hands pressing buttons that dispensed shadows instead of snack sand, though he tried to convince himself the cookies were a fluke, a one-off oddity in an otherwise mundane life. The memory of their warmth clung to him, pulling him toward the break room with a force he couldn't resist. His stomach growled, less from hunger than from anticipation, and as he rose from his chair, the creak of its springs echoed in the stillness. A sound that seemed to ripple through the empty cubicles like a warning he refused to heed. The hallway stretched before him, longer and darker than the night before, the flickering lights overhead buzzing faintly as if straining to stay alive. And when he reached the break room, the vending machine stood there waiting, its screen no longer blank, but alive with new words that stopped his breath. "Your lost item," it declared in that same stark, pulsing font. The letters glowing with an insistence that made his pulse quicken and his palms sweat despite the chill in the air. He hesitated, his fingers hovering over the button as doubt and curiosity warred within him, the rational part of his brain screaming that this was impossible, that vending machines didn't know your past, didn't dig into the corners of your life, where you'd buried things you couldn't face. But the other part, the part that still tasted those cookies, pressed the button before he could stop himself. And with a soft clatter, something small and metallic dropped into the tray, glinting under the flickering light. He reached in, his hand trembling as he pulled out a wristwatch, his wristwatch, the one he'd lost 5 years ago on a hiking trip, the one with the scratched face and the leather strap worn soft from years of wear. the one he'd given up on ever seeing again after it slipped from his wrist somewhere in the tangle of a forest trail he couldn't even remember. It was unmistakable, down to the tiny nick on the bezel from when he'd banged it against a rock, and as he turned it over, the faint ticking filled the silence. A sound that shouldn't have been possible after all this time. A sound that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the watch itself. He fastened it to his wrist, the leather cool against his skin, and stared at the vending machine, its screen now dark, as if it had finished its task and retreated into itself, leaving him with more questions than he could hold. How had it found this? Where had it been? And what kind of machine could pluck lost things from the ether and drop them into his hands like offerings? The weight of the watch anchored him, grounding him in a way the cookies hadn't, but it also unnerved him, because as he stood there, the second hand ticked backward, reversing time in tiny, deliberate increments. And though he told himself it was a trick of the light or a broken mechanism, the air around him grew heavier, thicker, as if the room itself were holding its breath. He stumbled back to his desk, the watches ticking a constant murmur against his pulse, and tried to work, but his eyes kept drifting to it, to the hands moving in the wrong direction. And by the time he left the office, the sky outside streaked with the gray of pre-dawn. He couldn't shake the feeling that the machine was playing with him, testing him, drawing him deeper into something he didn't understand, and that tomorrow night, when he returned, it would have something else waiting, something he might not be ready to face. By the third night, the office had taken on a different hue, its familiar corners and corridors warping under the weight of Daniel's growing unease, the fluorescent lights buzzing with a low, insistent hum that seemed to pulse in time with the backward ticking of the watch strapped to his wrist, its leather strap now warm from his skin, but no less alien for it. He'd spent the day in a daze, the spreadsheets forgotten as his mind churned with the impossibility of the vending machine's offerings cookies that shouldn't exist. A watch that defied time itself. And though he'd told himself he wouldn't go back, that he'd stay away from the break room and its mechanical oracle, the pull was stronger than his resolve. A thread of dread and fascination tugging him through the empty office as the clock crept past midnight once more. The air felt thicker tonight, heavy with a stillness that pressed against his chest. And as he walked the hallway, the shadows seemed to shift just out of sight, stretching and curling like fingers reaching for something they couldn't grasp, while the watch ticked relentlessly backward, counting down to a moment he couldn't predict but feared all the same. He reached the break room, his breath shallow and ragged, and there it was, the vending machine, its screen aglow with a new message that sent a chill racing down his spine. "Your last meal," it read. The words stark and unyielding, hanging in the digital void like a sentence handed down by a judge he couldn't see. He froze, his hand hovering inches from the button, the weight of those 3 words sinking into him like lead, each one a hammer strike against the fragile wall of his composure, his last meal. Not a memory or a lost trinket, but something final, something that carried the stench of inevitability. And for the first time, he wondered if the machine wasn't just giving, but taking. If each gift came with a cost he hadn't yet paid. The cookies had been a lure, the watch a warning, and now these a promise or a threat. He couldn't tell which, but it rooted him to the spot, his mind racing with images of his mother's kitchen, of her frail hand setting a plate before him, of meals he'd eaten without knowing they might be the last of their kind. He could walk away, he told himself, could turn back to his desk and leave the button unpressed, let the machine keep its secrets and its offerings. But the curiosity that had driven him this far tightened its grip, whispering that he needed to know, that he'd come too far to stop now. His trembling finger inched closer, brushing the cold plastic of the keypad as his heart thudded against his ribs. The screen pulsed, the words flickering as if impatient, and with a surge of defiance or desperation he wasn't sure which he pressed the button, the click echoing in the silence like a gunshot, and the machine whirred to life, its gears grinding as something heavy dropped into the tray with a dull thunk that reverberated through the room. He bent down, his breath catching as he pulled out a small, unmarked tin, its surface cool to the touch but radiating a faint warmth from within. And when he pried it open, the scent hit him first roasted meat, potatoes, a hint of rosemary, the exact dish his mother had made for his birthday years ago. The last meal they'd shared before her illness took hold, and the kitchen went cold. It was impossible, meticulous, a replica so perfect it brought tears to his eyes, even as his stomach churned with dread, and he stood there, staring at the food, the watch ticking backward, the lights flickering overhead, knowing he couldn't eat it not yet. Not when the words, "your last meal," still burned in his mind, a prophecy he wasn't ready to fulfill. He closed the tin, his hands shaking, and shoved it into his bag, the weight of it pulling at him as he stumbled back to his desk, the night stretching endlessly before him. The machine's promise, lingering like a shadow he couldn't outrun. The office that night seemed to close in around Daniel, its walls leaning inward as though the building itself were complicit in whatever game the vending machine was playing. The air thick, with a stillness that smothered sound, and left only the relentless backward ticking of the watch to mark the passage of time, each click a reminder of the tin in his bag and the meal he hadn't dared to touch. He sat at his desk, the glow of his monitor casting harsh shadows across his face. But the spreadsheets were a distant thought now, their numbers meaningless against the weight of what he'd carried back from the break room roasted meat and rosemary sealed in a tin, a memory-turned omen. And though he tried to focus, his hands kept drifting to the bag, fingers brushing the cool metal as if drawn by some unseen force, tempting him to open it again, to breathe in that scent that was both comfort and curse. The watch ticked on, its hands moving further into the past, and he couldn't shake the feeling that time itself was unraveling, that each gift from the machine was pulling him backward. Not just in memory, but in some deeper, more dangerous way, and the question gnawed at him. What happened when the hands reached zero, when there was no more past to reclaim? He hadn't eaten the meal, couldn't bring himself to lift the fork he'd found nestled in the tin, its tines glinting under the flickering lights, but the hunger was there, sharp and insistent, warring with the dread that coiled tighter around his chest with every passing minute, a dread that whispered this wasn't just food, wasn't just a gift, but a transaction he didn't understand. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor with a sound that shattered the silence, and paced the cubicle, his shadow stretching long and thin across the carpet as the lights buzzed overhead, their flicker syncing with the pulse in his temples, amplifying the unease that had taken root since the first night, since the cookies that shouldn't have been. The vending machine loomed in his mind, a sentinel in the break room, and he wondered if it was waiting for him to return, if it had more to offer or demanded the thought of going back. Of facing that screen again sent a shiver through him, though the curiosity, that damnable curiosity, tugged at him still, urging him to see what came next. To test the limits of this impossible thing that knew him better than he knew himself. He stopped pacing, his breath ragged, and glanced at the watch its hands had reversed past the hour he'd lost it, past the years it had lain buried in some forgotten place. And the realization hit him like a blow. The machine wasn't just giving him things, it was taking something back, rewinding his life with every offering. And the meal, that last meal, felt like a marker, a line he hadn't yet crossed, but couldn't avoid forever. He sank back into his chair, the tin's weight pulling at the bag slung over its arm, and stared at the screen, the cursor blinking like an eye that wouldn't close, while the office around him grew colder, darker, as if the light itself were being siphoned away, leaving him alone with his choices and their unseen cost. By the time the sky outside began to lighten, a faint gray seeping through the blinds, he hadn't touched the meal, hadn't gone back to the machine. But the decision felt less like resistance and more like delay. A postponement of something inevitable. And as he gathered his things to leave, the watch ticked louder, its rhythm a countdown he couldn't escape. He stepped into the hallway, the tin heavy in his bag, and cast one last glance toward the break room, its door ajar, the vending machine's glow spilling out like a beacon or a trepanned. Though he turned away, the pull remained, a thread tied to his ribs, promising that tomorrow night, when the clock ticked past midnight again, he'd be back, unable to resist the next offer, the next price, whatever it might be. The morning after the third night dawned gray and heavy, the sky outside the office building pressing down with a weight that mirrored the unease still clinging to Daniel's bones. Though he wasn't there to see it, no one saw him shuffle through the glass doors. No one heard the familiar creak of his chair or the tap of his fingers against the keyboard. And by the time the first of his coworkers trickled in, bleary-eyed and clutching coffee cups, his cubicle sat empty. The monitor dark, the bag with its unopened tin abandoned beneath the desk like a relic from a life interrupted. The office hummed to life around his absence, phones ringing and voices murmuring. But there was a hollowness to it, a gap no one could quite name, and as the hours ticked by forward now, not backward whispers began to spread. Soft at first, then sharper, about the man who'd been working late again, the one who'd looked more tired than usual, the one who hadn't answered his phone when they called to check on him. His desk became a curiosity, then a concern, the tin in the bag unnoticed until someone finally peeked inside, the scent of roasted meat and rosemary wafting out to mingle with the stale air, prompting frowns and questions no one could answer. Where had it come from? Why was it here? And where was Daniel, the man who'd left it behind? Back in the break room, the vending machine stood silent, its screen blank and lifeless, no pulsing words to beckon or warn, just a cold, mechanical shell that offered nothing to the curious glances of those who passed by, its hum absent, its secrets locked away as if it had never stirred from its mundane purpose. The watch, still strapped to Daniel's wrist wherever he was, had stopped ticking sometime in the night, its hands frozen at an hour no one could read. And though no one knew it, the backward countdown had reached its end. The machine's final gift delivered, its price collected in a currency no one could see. The tin remained uneaten, a meal untouched, and as the day wore on, the office settled into an uneasy routine, the empty desk a silent question mark, the vending machine a forgotten witness to whatever had unfolded in the flicker of those late-night hours. Someone called his apartment, the line ringing endlessly into a void, and someone else drove by, finding the windows dark, the mailbox overflowing, but no sign of the man who once lived there. No trace of where he'd gone or why he'd vanished after that last night when the clock had ticked past midnight and the machine had offered its final, fateful choice. By evening, the office emptied out again, the lights dimming one by one, and the break room fell back into shadow, the vending machine standing alone, its screen flickering briefly to life just for a moment before going dark once more, as if resetting itself, waiting for the next weary soul to wander in, hungry and curious, unaware of the thread that might pull them under. Daniel's name lingered in the air for a while, a murmur on lips that soon moved on to other things, and the tin was eventually tossed, its contents growing cold and forgotten, a last meal no one claimed. The building sighed into the night, its secrets buried in the hum of its machinery, and somewhere, perhaps, Daniel existed, still caught in the backward spin of a watch that no longer ticked. Trapped in a moment the machine had reclaimed her. Perhaps he was gone entirely, dissolved into the cost of its offerings, leaving only an empty desk and a story no one could finish. A tale written in the silence between one night and the next, where the vending machine waited, patient and implacable, for its next turn to dispense something more than snacks.